Hello, 6th grade artists. So as you can see, I have my columns sketches here, the Doric, the Ionic, and on the back I've got my Corinthian. And what I'm going to be doing in this video is just talking about and showing you all a couple different ways that you can actually finish your Greek columns in terms of adding color, detail, shading, that kind of stuff. So we're going to zoom in a little bit here so that we can see things a bit better. But I do want to quickly show you some examples that I have finished first. And these are a little bit smaller so that I could do them quickly. But here is an example of the Corinthian column. Remember, it's the one that has all the fanciness, all the leaves and the swirlies and the flowers and different things like that. And this example is just regular old shading so that I've got darker values where the shadows are, and then gradually I press down less and less with my pencil to make lighter values and then leave the highlights white. Here is an example that is similar in terms of shading because it does still have darker values fading into the lighter values, but this example uses color as well. So you can absolutely do shading with a regular pencil, or you could do shading with a colored pencil. You can also do shading with both. So if you want to combine a colored pencil with a regular pencil, you absolutely could. And so since my light source on this one is up here, where I have my little sunburst, you'll see that this side of the column is where all of the lightest values are. This side, because it's far away from the light source, is where all of my darker values will be. And then you can also use just color design patterns, however you choose to use on your Greek column. The main thing is, since they are Greek columns, we do want to make sure that we are paying attention to sort of the whole idea of having it finished really neatly, having it look as perfect and pretty and clean as possible. Because remember, those are some of the key components of Greek art and architecture. So we want to make sure that we do the same thing. So now I'll move these examples and I will show you a little bit of how to do some of the shading, especially because I feel like that is probably what you guys are potentially the least familiar with. So for this particular column, I'm going to have my light source be over here. And you don't have to draw a light source on yours. If it helps you remember where your shading needs to be, then definitely go ahead and do that. But since the light is on the left-hand side here, then the left-hand side of my column is where all of my lightest values will be. The right-hand side is where all of my darker values will be. So I'm just going to start in one of those darker sections, holding my pencil pretty far back, and then just kind of start going across that space, getting a little bit lighter as I move across. So you'll notice that my pencil is moving quickly up and down, but it's moving slowly across that space. So that might be sort of the first little beginning of that shadow there. So I'm going to zoom in more so we can see. And I'm actually going to flip my page because for me it's easier to shade with the tip of my pencil where the darker part is, and then getting lighter as I move across to the right. So definitely pay attention to which way works better for you because everybody is different. And some people use their left hand, in which case the opposite direction might be easier. So I'm just going to kind of clean up that edge a little bit by going the other direction now. But when I am going the other direction, it's very important to make sure that I'm keeping my value nice and smooth there. So I want to make sure I keep those pencil lines really close together so that they don't start to look like a whole bunch of just marks going crisscross. We want to make sure that all of our marks look nice and smooth so that they just kind of create a value transition together instead of just individual pencil marks. So the shading does take a little bit of time, but it's definitely worth it if you are interested in trying to learn how to shade. Definitely worth giving it a go and trying it out. So now I'm pressing down barely at all, so it's nice and light right there. And then what I would do at this point would just be one more layer so that I get really good and dark in that darkest part by pressing down nice and hard. And then as I move across, again, I'm going to press down less and less. Because the way that you change the value that you are using is simply by the amount of pressure you put down on the paper with your pencil. The more pressure you put down, the harder you press down, the darker that value is going to be. And you probably will not want to use a lead pencil on this step if you can help it. I know some of you might only have lead pencils, and that's okay. But if you have a regular pencil like this, it will be better for shading. So then what I'm going to do is here, because this part of the sort of plate area just goes behind this part of the column, I'm just going to make it as dark as I can. So that it looks kind of like a hole in there. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on this one. Make it as dark as I can. And then the same thing would happen up here on the bottom of the square portion. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and press down really hard at the front edge here. I'm going to leave a little bit of white as I get toward that shadow area, just to separate the shadow of the column and the shadow of the top part. It's technically called reflected light, and we learn that more in high school art, but I do want you guys to go ahead and try to leave yourself some reflected light there. And then this is all going to be good and dark up here. Because since this is sort of the underside of this top part, it's going to be pretty dark. You will notice that as I move toward the light source still, I am going to get a little bit lighter, but not as light as a highlight would be. It's still going to be pretty dark under here. So once again, a nice smooth value transition is what we are going for, so that there's not a specific spot that we can point at as when it starts to get lighter. It kind of just gradually happens. So it's really dark over here. It's still pretty dark over here, because it is still the under part of that particular column. So on this side, the sort of shadow area on the bottom is going to be about the same value as this part. So on this side it's really, really dark. On this side it's still pretty dark, but just not quite as dark. Simply because of where the light source is. Because it's over here. So then this, and this part would all be shaded basically the same way as this first band was. The top part, similar concept. I'm going to turn my page. And then it's still going to be a gradient that goes from dark to light. But it's not going to be quite as dark as the under part of this sort of square slab. And I am still going to build up that value in layers. So none of this particular part will be white. And then I'm going to go ahead and do another layer. And the main reason that we want to make sure that we are shading in layers is because if you start too dark, it's really, really hard to fix it by making it lighter. But if you start too light, it's much, much easier to correct it by adding more layers and darkening up the value. So it's a lot easier to add value than it is to take it away in terms of shading. So again, I'm going to go the opposite direction now just to smooth out the edges. And remember, you can do this with colored pencil, you can do this with a regular pencil. The technique is exactly the same. You press down more even with a colored pencil to make the darker values and press down less to make the lighter values. So the same exact technique is what you would be using, but you can also use multiple colors to help you out a little bit more with that. And I will show you that in just a moment. So that might be sort of the beginning of the top part of my column. Now this part is not going to be completely white, but what's going to happen is that there's going to be a bit of a gradient going down. Because the light source is down here, then the top part of this is going to be a little bit darker than the bottom part. So I'm going to actually have a gradient going down first. And then I am still going to have a gradient going across this way, but it's not going to be nearly as dark as this one was. So that might be about the only little bit of shading I do on that particular portion, because we want to make sure that it's lighter than this one, since the light source is over here. Now, usually there is just a little bit of shading on this side. A very light, very small gradient. Same thing on this part, very small little gradient. Because then this particular part of my column would have the same gradient as this does. And basically what we're going to do is make both of these sort of plate areas match. And it does get a little challenging because it is so small there, but it's still the same concept. Go up and down, and then go the opposite direction. Keep those pencil lines really close together so that everything stays nice and smooth as you are starting to add the shading to those little bands on your column. Gonna go ahead and do another layer here. Go back the other way to keep that smooth on the edge. Now, one interesting thing is that this part of our column, the part that goes between these two plates, is going to be done basically the same way. It's just going to be darker because it's a little bit more on the inside. So that would be the beginning of our column. And like I said, this part is going to be the same way as these two. It's just darker. Same thing for this one and for this. Now on this part, where we've got sort of the fluting, it's going to be darkest at the top and lightest at the bottom, but still also darker on the right-hand side here. Kind of like how this example is.